The Case of Jennie Brice by Mary Roberts Reinhardt. Read by Ghosty Keys. Chapter 9. The coroner held an inquest over the headless body the next day, Tuesday. Mr. Graves telephoned me in the morning and I went to the morgue with him. I do not like the morgue, although some of my neighbors pay it weekly visits. It is, by way of excursion, like Nickelodeons or watching the circus put up its tents. I have heard them threaten children that if they misbehaved, they would not be taken to the morgue that week. But it was not for me. I failed to identify the body. How could I? It had been a tall woman, probably 5 feet 8, and I thought maybe the fingernails looked like those of Jennie Brice. The thumbnail, though, was broken off. I told Mr. Graves about her speaking of a broken nail, but he shrugged his shoulders and said nothing. There was a curious scar over the heart, and he made a sketch of it. Looked like a capital letter F with a backwards L on top. It reached from the center of the chest for about 6 inches across the left breast, a narrow thin line that one could hardly see. Well, I felt sure that Jennie Brice had no such scar, and Mr. Graves thought as I did. Temple Hope called to the inquest and said she had never heard of one, and Mr. Ladley himself at the inquest swore that his wife had nothing of the sort. I was watching him, and I did not think he was lying, and yet the hand was very like Jennie Brice's. It was all a bit bewildering. Much better. Mr. Ladley's testimony at the inquest was disappointing. He was cool and collected, said he had no reason to believe that his wife was dead, and less reason to think that she had been drowned. She had left him in a rage, and if she found out that by hiding she was putting him in an unpleasant position, she would probably hide indefinitely. To the disappointment of everybody, the identity of the woman remained a mystery. No one with such a scar was missing. A small woman of my own age, a Miss Murray, whose daughter, a stenographer, had disappeared, also attended the inquest. But her daughter also had no such scar, and wore her nails very short because she used a typewriter. Alice Murray was the missing girl's name, and her mother sat beside me and cried through the whole inquest. One thing was brought out at the inquest. The body had been thrown into the river after death. There was no water in the lungs, and the verdict was death by hands of person or persons unknown. Well, Mr. Holcomb was not satisfied, and some way or other he had got permission to attend the autopsy, and he had brought away the tracing of the scar. All the way home in the streetcar he stared at the drawing, holding first one eye shut and then the other. But like the coroner, he got nowhere. He folded the paper and put it in his notebook. I tell you, nonetheless, Mrs. Pittman, that is the body of Jennie Brice, and her husband killed her, probably by strangling her. He took the body out to the boat, dropped it in the swollen river above 9th Street Bridge. Well, why do you think he strangled her? There was no mark on the body, no poison was found. Well, then if he strangled her, where did the blood come from? I don't limit myself to strangulation. Maybe he cut her throat. Or brained her with my onyx clock, I said. And as I thought of it, I missed the clock more and more. He went down in his pockets and brought up a key. I'd forgotten this, he said. It shows you were right that the clock was there when the Ladleys took the room. I found it in the yard this morning. When I got home from the inquest, I found another of old Isaac's baskets in waiting. I'm not a crying woman, but I could hardly see my mother's picture through the tears. But that is not the Brice story, and I am not writing the sordid tragedy of my own life. So we'll move on. That was on Tuesday. Jennie Brice had been missing 9 days. In all that time, although she was cast for the piece at the theater that week, no one had heard from her. Her relatives had had no word. She had gone away. If she had gone, on a cold March night in the flood, in a striped black and white dress with a red collar and a red and black hat, without her fur coat which she had worn every day all winter. She had gone out very early in the morning, or perhaps during the night. But how had she gone? Ladley said he rowed her to Federal Street at 6:30 and had brought the boat back. After they had quarreled violently all night, and when she was leaving him, wouldn't he have allowed her to just take it away herself? Besides, the police found no trace of her on the early train. And then at daylight between 5 and 6, my own brother had seen a woman with Mr. Howe. A woman who might have been Jennie Brice. But if it was, why did Mr. Howe not say so? Mr. Ladley claimed she was hiding in revenge, but Jennie Brice was not really that sort of woman. There was something bigger about her. Something that is found in some women, a lack of spite. She was not petty or malicious. Her faults, like her virtues, were out for all to see. In spite of the failure to identify the body, Mr. Ladley was arrested that night, Tuesday, and this time it was for murder. I know now that the police were taking long chances. They had no strong motive for the crime, and as Mr. Holcomb said, they had no provocation. They had provocation but not motive, which is different. They had opportunity, and they had lots of straggling links of clues which made a fair chain of circumstantial evidence. But that was it. And this is the way the case stood on Tuesday night, March 13th. Mr. Ladley was taken away at 9 o'clock. He was perfectly cool, asked me to help him pack a suitcase, and whistled while it was being done. He requested to be allowed to walk to jail and went quietly with a detective on one side, and I think a sheriff's officer on the other. Just before he left, he asked for a word or two with me, and when he paid his bill up to date, he gave me an extra $1 for taking care of Peter. I was almost overcome. He took the manuscript of his play with him, and I remember his asking if he could have any typing done in the jail. I've never seen a man arrested for murder before, but I think he was the coolest suspect the officers had ever seen. They had no idea what to make of him. Well, Mr. Reynolds and I had a cup of tea after the excitement and were sitting in the dining room table drinking it when the bell rang. And it was Mr. Howe. He half staggered into the room when I opened the door and was going for the parlor bedroom without a word. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Ladley's gone if you want him," I said, and I thought his face cleared. "Gone? Where?" "To jail." He did not reply all at once. He just stood there, tapping the palm of his hand with the forefinger of the other. He was dirty and unshaven, and his clothes looked as if he had been sleeping in them. "So they've got him," he muttered finally, and turning, and he was about to go out the front door with another word, but I caught his arm. "You're sick, Mr. Howe." "You'd better not go out just yet." "Oh, I'm all right." He took his handkerchief out and wiped his face, and I saw that his hands were shaking. "No, you're not. Come back and have a cup of tea and a slice of homemade bread." He hesitated and looked at his watch. "Oh, I'll do it, Mrs. Pittman. I suppose I'd better throw a little fuel on the engine of mine. It's been going hard for several days." Well, he ate like a wolf. I cut half a loaf of slices for him, and he drank the rest of the tea. Mr. Reynolds creaked up to bed and left him still eating and me cutting and spreading. Now that I had a chance to see him, I was shocked. The rims of his eyes were red, his collar was black, and his hair hung over his forehead. When he finally sat back and looked at me, his color was a little better. "So they've canned him," he said. "Time enough, too," said I. He leaned forward and put both his elbows on the table. "Mrs. Pittman," he said earnestly, "I don't like him any more than you do. But he never killed that woman." "Well, somebody killed her." "How do you know? How do you know she's dead?" "Well, I didn't, of course. I just felt it." "The police haven't even proved a crime. They can't hold a man for supposititious murder." "Well, perhaps they can't, but they're doing it. If the woman's alive, she won't let him hang." "I'm not so sure of that," he said heavily and got up. He looked in the mirror over the sideboard and brushed his hair back. "I look bad enough, but I feel worse." "Well, you saved my life, Mrs. Pittman. Thank you. How is Miss Harvey?" I asked when we started out. He turned and smiled at me in his boyish way. "The best ever. I haven't seen her for days, but it seems like centuries. You know, she's the only girl in the world for me, Miss Pittman, although She is beautiful, isn't she?" "Very beautiful," I answered. "Her mother always was." "Her mother?" He looked at me curiously. "Yes, I knew her mother many years ago," I said, putting my best face on the mistake that I could. "Then I'll remember you to her if she ever allows me to see her again. Currently, I'm persona non grata." "If you'll do a kindly thing for Miss Howe," I said. "If you'll do me a kindly thing, Mr. Howe," I said, sorry. "You'll forget me to her. Don't tell her that you met me." He looked into my eyes and then thrust out his hand. "All right. I'll not ask any questions. I guess there are some curious stories hidden in these old houses." Peter hobbled to the front door with him. He had not gone so far as the parlor once while Mr. Ladley was in the house. Well, they had a sale of spring flowers at the store that day, and Mr. Reynolds brought me a pot of white tulips. That night, I hung up my mother's picture over the mantel in the dining room and put up the tulips beneath it. It gave me a feeling of comfort. I had never seen my mother's grave or put flowers on it.